So I'm an assistant psychologist working with the HSC currently. And today I'm be presenting a piece of research I conducted as part of my master's in UCD. So I'll begin by giving some context as to how I came to study this area of brain injury. So why this topic? Well, during my time in UCD, my supervisor was Professor Christine Linehan, who is the director of the UCD Centre for Disability Studies. And Christine acted as a great link between myself and Barbara Waldron at the time. And it was Barbara who originally put forward the idea for this research. She explained a concern she had that there appeared to be very little knowledge or practice around caring for individuals with acquired brain injury sustained through a suicide attempt. And what I mean by that is someone who attempts suicide, survives that attempt, but has sustained a brain injury in the process. And I think myself and Christine were both quite taken with the idea that this apparent gap in the knowledge was being identified at ground level by professionals who were working in these areas. And we set about developing some research on it. So the first thing we did was to do a literature review. And what did we find here? Well, firstly, there's a vast body of literature surrounding suicidality post-ABI. And the focus of this research appeared to be on acquired brain injury as a risk factor for suicide following sustaining the injury. And while that's an excellent body of research and incredibly useful in our understanding of brain injury, its focus was essentially looking in the opposite direction to our area of interest. So the sequence we were looking for was suicide leading to ABI, not ABI leading to suicide. Secondly, there was very little information looking in the direction we were focusing on. So from the outset, this area of research appeared almost non-existent. And this brought us on to our third notable obstacle. There appeared to be no established nomenclature or terminology for this injury. So the limited research we did come across used varying terminology to describe suicide leading to ABI. And that really created a lack of conceptual clarity, I suppose, regarding what was the injury being examined and how to extract data on it in a meaningful way from the existing literature. And finally, then the data that was in existence was widely dispersed and often incidental to the primary focus of the research. So not only was it difficult to identify the data within the literature, but it could also be very limited in terms of characterising this population, in terms of things that might be relevant like pre-morbid conditions, the injury mechanism, injury severity, and rehabilitative needs. So the current study, given the obstacles presented in researching this area, it was decided that a systematic scoping review of the literature be conducted, because this methodology was going to allow for a few things. Firstly, the breadth of the heterogeneous and fragmented literature on this topic to be established and collated in a systematic way. Also for the gaps in the literature to be identified and to inform recommendations for future research. And thirdly, then scoping reviews are particularly suited to rehabilitative sciences where a lack of randomised controlled trials can make it challenging for systematic reviews to be conducted. So with these factors in mind, we developed our research objective, which was to conduct a scoping review of literature surrounding acquired brain injury sustained secondary to a suicide attempt, to establish the current body of research on injury outcomes and rehabilitative needs for this population. So if we move then to our method, how did we go about this? You'll see here we used a 5-stage framework for the conduct of scoping reviews. And this began with identifying out the research question. So our research question was, what is known from existing literature about individuals who sustain an ABI secondary to a suicide attempt, their injury outcome, and their rehabilitative needs? Then identifying the relevant studies. So this is a bit of a public health warning here. I don't expect anyone to attempt to read through this, but it's to give you kind of visual representation of the scope of the search strategy and how there was overlap and different types of terminology used across our different databases. So we used 4 electronic databases and we conducted search strategy developed from the key terms in the research question. And that was further defined based on our preliminary findings and also database specific terminology. So some of these databases had a thesaurus function where you could pick specific terms that they used or they applied to certain areas or topics of research. So our third stage then was study selection. Studies were selected based on our inclusion and exclusion criteria. So we had a few inclusion criteria. They were They had to contain an original or secondary set of data on a population or individual with an ABI sustained secondary to a suicide attempt. And they had to be published during or before 2017, as this research was being conducted in 2018. They needed to be published in the English language, and they needed to be peer-reviewed publications. And our only exclusion criteria was that if they focused exclusively on suicide attempts following an ABI, they would not be included. So if the sequence of events was not in the direction we were looking at. Then charting the data. So a number of data charting forms were designed for data extraction on our outcomes of interest from selected studies. And the first form extracted descriptive data to characterize the population. And the data were also extracted on the terminology used in each article to refer to the injury. And two further forms were developed to extract and collate data on the population's demographics, pre-morbid characteristics, injury demographics, and then commentary on rehabilitative needs. So then we come to reporting our results. So due to the wide variation in study designs and variables that are reported in the selected papers in this piece of research, a qualitative rather than a quantitative review was conducted in order to identify and compile any common findings that would contribute to the research question in terms of study design, participants, settings, terminology, injury outcomes, or rehabilitative needs. All the studies were analysed under these headings. So our results then, what did we find? Another one, I wouldn't ask anyone to read through this necessarily, but it's just to give you an idea of the framework that was used. So we began with 595 citations, which went through deduplication, screening of abstracts and titles, additions from hand-searching references and citations of included papers, and finally full article screening. That brought us down to 32 articles to include for the review. So what did we find in those articles? As a general overview, study design varied across the included articles, with the most commonly used design being retrospective studies using secondary data. Single case studies were the next most frequently used design, and the remaining 5 studies were prospective cohort studies using either adult or teenage populations with ABIs. Then sample sizes varied markedly across the included studies due to the heterogeneity of the study design, so our single case studies versus our retrospective cohort studies. And as such, the prevalence of the injury was similarly varying. So 13 of the articles included participants with an ABI secondary to a suicide attempt as part of a larger cohort, while just 3 focused exclusively on ABI sustained secondary to a suicide attempt. And another thing to note was the terminology used in the literature to describe this injury also varies significantly. One of the most common terms being used was self-inflicted injury, but even this was used under the broader term of intentional injury, which encompassed other inflicted brain injuries, so maybe an assault or an accident, and self-inflicted injuries, which would then refer to a suicide attempt. Another commonly used term was very simply just attempted suicide. So if we're to look at our terminology a little bit closer, this is a figure from the study. It's a word cloud that displays the frequency of a term used in proportion to its size. So you'll see there are some more unusual terms in this literature. Terms like unsuccessful suicide attempt, failed suicide attempt, and suicide survivors as well. Next, we'll come to look at our demographics. So what did this population look like? In terms of characterising the population, findings were so limited that we report only on what the available data indicates. So generally, we found that more data was available on males than on females, and the most prominent age bracket within this being 31 to 45 years. However, 5 studies did not report on the age. Injury outcomes then. So injury measures from the selected studies were grouped into 4 categories: neurological, functional, psychosocial, and quantitative. The most commonly used outcome measure was neurological outcomes, so brain imaging, followed by functional outcome measures, which consisted of a number of psychometric scales measuring cognitive ability and motor skills. And psychosocial measures were used in only 7 of the 32 studies. So quantitative measures of the injury were used in 5 studies to characterise the injury severity in novel ways. So for example, we have a few here. One was length of stay in acute care, that's LOS. PTA stands for post-traumatic amnesia. ISS is an injury severity score, and then DAMA refers to rates of discharge against medical advice for those sustaining an ABI secondary to a suicide attempt. So the injury outcomes are measured in a variety of ways. So premorbid conditions then, a large subset of studies did not report on premorbid conditions of those with an ABI secondary to a suicide attempt, 15 out of our 32. And among those that did, there was much heterogeneity again. The most frequently reported premorbid condition was substance abuse, followed by suicide attempts, or previous suicide attempts, I should say, depression, and variations of bipolar disorder were also reported on in 2 of the studies. So what did we find then in terms of our rehabilitative needs? Well, only 7 studies addressed rehabilitative needs of those sustaining an ABI secondary to a suicide attempt. And of these 7, 4 studies recommended that clinicians be aware of premorbid conditions when treating an individual with this injury, due to the potential influence on their rehabilitation. One study recommended that the mechanism of the injury should be known by clinicians due to poor outcomes associated with ABI sustained secondary to a suicide attempt compared with other ABI populations. Social support was cited by 2 papers as an important component in rehabilitation for those with ABI sustained secondary to a suicide attempt for both the individual and their families. However, in total then, 25 out of our 32 studies did not comment on the rehabilitative needs of this population. So if we're to look at those results in a little bit more detail then, we'll move to our discussion. A few things to note about our findings. So firstly, prevalence. The prevalence of this etiology, it ranged in the studies included from 0.8% to 57% as a proportion of all causes of ABI. However, these findings may not represent the salience of the injury accurately. It's probably likely that they don't. They may overestimate the prevalence due to the large number of single case studies, or indeed underestimate due to the aggregating of suicide attempts with other intentional means of sustaining an acquired brain injury. So the prevalence is difficult to establish given the data available for analysis here. Secondly then, the data from the articles reviewed indicate that individuals sustaining an ABI secondary to a suicide attempt that are documented are more commonly male, aged 31 to 45 years, and have experienced substance abuse and or depression prior to sustaining their injuries. However, there was no report of sex, age, or premorbid conditions in a significant number of the included studies, 7 in total. And therefore, the demographic of information available for extraction, again, may not accurately characterise this population. Premorbid characteristics then. So all studies reported that their sample or subsample had an ABI sustained through suicide attempt. However, 15 of them did not report on premorbid conditions for their samples. Many of the single case studies included had a primarily neurological focus that aimed to map a functional deficit onto a neurological injury and omitting any analysis of premorbid conditions. However, even the prospective and retrospective studies that explicitly report on injury outcome did not account for premorbid conditions in some cases. So those that did frequently reported that premorbid conditions have a significant impact upon injury outcome. And as we know, recovery from an ABI can be particularly complex due to a confluence of a number of factors. However, for this population, the added factor of pre-existing psychiatric conditions or psychiatric distress could likely compound this recovery further. Injury outcomes then. So our neurological and functional outcomes were the most frequently reported injury outcomes, with focus on physical and memory impairments. And in general, findings indicate poorer functional outcomes for this population compared with other ABI populations, probably due to the more severe injuries sustained via more intentionally lethal means. And of the studies that did report psychosocial injury outcomes, few reported on suicidality. Increased likelihood of post-injury suicide attempts in those sustaining an ABI through attempted suicide has raised concern in literature, and the limited data reporting on this indicates that these concerns are well-founded, as subsequent suicide attempts have been found, as I said, in limited studies to be more likely in those whose ABIs is a result of the suicide attempt compared with those who sustain their ABI through other means. And given the vast body of literature that exists surrounding suicidality following ABI, it is perhaps surprising that more attention has not been directed to suicidality as an injury outcome in this specific population. Finally then, rehabilitative needs. So rehabilitative needs of this population are rarely addressed in the literature. The findings presented here indicate that this population have significant needs that are specific to their injury. The lack of evidence-based commentary identified indicates a real dearth of tailored rehabilitative services for this population. And the generalisability of evidence-based care for ABI to this population has been questioned in literature. And as the evidence base is largely generated by research using those with self and other inflicted TB or ABIs, findings from this review indicate that this may not sufficiently address the needs of those individuals. But an interesting thing to note is that there exists a small body of research surrounding the palliative care of this population. So this involves patients treated in hospice settings for life-limiting injuries sustained by a suicide attempt that are not immediately life-threatening. And this research highlights important components of care that could be applied to this population. So, for example, it acknowledges the polytrauma, as it puts it, experience of the individual and the need for interdisciplinary care, and emphasises the importance of supporting the individuals and the family in acceptance of this double hardship and knowledge of how the injury occurred and the extensive disability sustained. So finally then, we'll just move to a quick summary. So we conducted a scoping review on the literature surrounding suicide attempts leading to ABI. 32 articles were reviewed and limited research was found with varying prevalence and demographics available. Trends in the data available indicate generally poorer outcomes for individuals with this injury compared with those who sustain their ABI through other means. Rehabilitative needs were rarely addressed, and the limited findings indicate complex factors are associated with this injury that may have implications for rehabilitation. So just some limitations to consider when we're talking about this research. Firstly, the scoping review methodology. It's considered pertinent to acknowledge that despite best efforts, relevant research may have been omitted. And it also includes no assessment of quality of studies. And as such, the limited data reporting on demographics, injury outcome, and rehabilitation needs may indeed vary in quality of design, and the findings extracted from these studies should be interpreted accordingly. So what recommendations do we have then for future research? Firstly, to develop an accurate and appropriate terminology. So this creates significant difficulty in collating findings and using them to inform evidence-based practice. It's prohibited to the development of the field and needs to be addressed in order to make advancements. Secondly, then, a number of significant gaps in the literature were identified regarding injury outcomes and rehabilitative needs. So future research seeking to characterise this injury etiology should probably recognise the potential influence of pre-morbid conditions on injury outcome for this population. And this will contribute significantly to informing care and rehabilitation for the individual, whose recovery is likely compounded by pre-existing mental health difficulties. Finally then, given the complex nature of this injury, it suggests that a biopsychosocial model of care be explored. Findings suggest that there are a number of interacting functional and psychosocial factors to be addressed in caring for these individuals, and the lack of evidence-based findings regarding rehabilitation highlights a significant gap in the research, indicating rehabilitative services likely have not been equipped with the knowledge to meet these needs fully. Tailored approaches to care for these individuals and their families that reflect these extensive needs should be explored. So that brings me then to the end of the presentation. Thank you for your time today.